Comment on the video, where are people watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Subscribe and like if you hate Karens and comment down below what city or country you're watching from, I announced, my tone casual but laced with mischief. My name is Evan Carter, and I'm here to tell you the unbelievable story of how I accidentally made a Karen homeless, all starting on one fateful Saturday that felt straight out of a suburban nightmare. It began like any typical Saturday in our quiet cul-de-sac of Pleasantview. I was fulfilling my weekly ritual, washing my black car. Yes, a black car in the summer is a commitment, but I'm a glutton for punishment. Armed with my trusty bucket, a jug of soap, and a playlist of classic soul tunes, I was in my element. My driveway may not be expansive, but on a Saturday morning, it becomes my private car spa. The sun was shining, the birds provided a generic soundtrack, and I was actually enjoying the simple pleasure of scrubbing away the week's grime. Of course, not everyone in Pleasantview shared this leisurely bliss. Earlier in the week, my neighbor, an infamous figure among us who happens to be a self-appointed enforcer for the HOA and the very definition of a Karen, had given me the stink eye for merely breathing too loudly. But I'd shrugged that off until that Saturday. Today, as I finished hauling away the detritus of a weekend spent demolishing my late mother-in-law's outdated ceramic gnome collection, I encountered her. There she was, Karen, I won't reveal her full name, standing rigidly on her porch. Her meticulously maintained lawn contrasted sharply with the chaos I had just left behind. In her arms, she clutched her chihuahua, an overfed little dog she pompously named Princess Paws. The pet trembled as Karen glared, her look as icy as a winter morning. I offered a friendly wave, thinking it was one of those routine polite gestures that often go unacknowledged. Instead, my greeting hit a wall of disapproval. For a moment, I wondered if it was just another one of those Karen days, when every minor act of normalcy is met with outrage. I had no idea then that this encounter would spark an avalanche of events culminating in a complete social and legal meltdown for her. My car, my humble pride and joy, was about to become the centerpiece in a suburban drama that would leave one particular Karen reeling. As I went back to my car and resumed washing it in peace, a nagging thought crept into my mind: what if this was only the beginning? Little did I know, my simple act of cleaning was about to collide with Karen's absolute intolerance for anything that didn't fit her narrow view of order, a view that would soon unravel her entire world. I finished my car wash with a lingering sense of unease, unaware that destiny was preparing a full-blown spectacle. That Saturday, as Pleasantview buzzed with ordinary weekend life, my seemingly mundane activities had set the stage for a story of epic karmic justice, one in which the overzealous, overbearing Karen would soon face consequences she'd never imagined. The following morning, I awoke with a lingering buzz from yesterday's events. I, Evan Carter, couldn't shake the image of Karen's steely glare as I went about my routine. Over breakfast, my wife Megan Carter asked, "What's got you looking so serious, Evan?" I recounted the previous day. While I was diligently washing my car, Karen had appeared on her porch, glaring and frowning at every soapy bubble. I explained how I had been peacefully performing my car wash ritual when suddenly, her presence disrupted the serenity of my morning. According to local gossip in Pleasantview, Karen had a reputation for punishing even the smallest deviations from her strict neighborhood standards, and yesterday was no exception. "I'm surprised you didn't hear her say something meaner," Megan teased, though her tone betrayed concern. I shrugged it off at the time, determined not to let one sour interaction ruin my day. But as the hours passed, I began to notice a few unsettling details. Neighbors who'd exchanged curt greetings now whispered behind closed doors, and I could sense the entire cul-de-sac was on high alert. Evidently, Karen had made a point of her discontent. After my breakfast, I decided to take a long walk around Pleasantview to clear my head. As I strolled along tree-lined streets, I recalled every moment, the way the morning sun had lit up the glistening droplets on my car, the satisfying lather of the soap, and then, out of nowhere, the interjection of Karen's accusing stare. I passed a couple of houses where I overheard quiet complaints. "That guy's always doing something weird with his car," one said, as if my routine maintenance somehow threatened their own peace. The further I walked, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a car wash, it was about control. In a neighborhood where order was prized above all, any deviation, however mundane, was subject to scrutiny by those entrusted, or self-appointed, with neighborhood authority. I recalled Mr. Henderson, a kindly older gentleman who once confided, "In Pleasantview, you learn quickly that every action is measured. The HOA and, more importantly, Karen, have eyes everywhere." His words rang bitterly true now. Determined not to let the sting of yesterday's encounter fester, I made a mental note to document everything. I began jotting down details of the incident, the time, the setting, even the color of my soap suds glistening in the daylight. I knew that if I ever needed to defend my actions or challenge Karen's overreach, I'd have the evidence at hand. It wasn't paranoia, I was simply preparing for the possibility that my rights might be tested once again by this vigilant enforcer of suburbia. Returning home, I set up a small log on my computer. I outlined how my car had been my pride, my sanctuary, a simple black car cared for in my modest driveway. And yet, that very act of maintaining it had been twisted into an accusation of causing suspicious activity, in the eyes of a narrow-minded enforcer. I scanned through my photos from the previous day and even recorded a short voice memo describing the scene in detail. Every soapy droplet, every glimmer of sunlight had been part of an otherwise peaceful morning, now marred by someone's need to control and dominate. As the day unfolded, Megan and I discussed the incident quietly. "You know," Megan said, "it might be worth letting the HOA know exactly what happened." I hesitated. There was a part of me that resented this petty act of neighborhood censorship, but I also knew that challenging Karen might mean confronting the very fabric of Pleasantview's expectations. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, I resolved that I would stand up for my rights. I wasn't about to let anyone dictate how I should go about washing my car or managing my property. And so, with a renewed sense of determination, I promised myself that I would not only continue to live my life normally but would also prepare to contest any further interference from Karen. I began researching local laws regarding property rights and the limitations on HOA interventions, arming myself with knowledge for the next inevitable encounter. That evening, as I watched the sunset from our back porch, a view punctuated by the occasional car passing by, I felt a mix of calm and resolve. My experience had transformed from a simple inconvenience into a stand for personal freedom in a community that, under the guise of order, seemed to demand conformity at any cost. The day's events had set me on a path I hadn't anticipated, one where even a humble car wash could become a battleground for justice. And as I turned in that night, I knew this was only the beginning. The next few days after that fateful incident, I, Evan Carter, found myself continuously reeling from the absurdity of it all. My peaceful routine in Pleasantview had been shattered not by anything I'd done, but by the relentless overreaction of one particular person, Karen. I couldn't help but reflect on how a simple act like washing my car had been twisted into an accusation of suspicious activity, fueled by nothing more than a desire to enforce her narrow notion of order. It all came crashing down one crisp morning when I returned to my driveway. I was greeting the day with a cup of coffee in hand and a mind buzzing with my new research on property rights, prepared, if needed, to stand firm against further harassment, when I noticed a shadow at the edge of my property. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Karen, once again, perched in her usual spot. This time, however, she wasn't alone, a glimmer of determination shone in her eyes that suggested today would be different. I approached my car, still bearing the remnants of yesterday's thorough wash, when the sound of a siren pierced the calm air. 2 police cruisers rolled up quietly at first, but then blared their sirens as if under orders to enforce some unwritten suburban code. I stood frozen, uncertain if I was witnessing another of Karen's machinations. Moments later, a stern-faced officer stepped out of one cruiser. His uniform was sharp, his gaze measured, a stark contrast to the casual style I'd been enjoying just moments before. "Mr. Carter, can you explain what's happening here?" he asked in a level tone. I glanced toward Karen, who was now glaring across the street with an expression that radiated self-righteous indignation. "I'm simply washing my car in my driveway," I replied. "My property, this is my private space." The officer frowned slightly, checking his notepad. "We received a report about suspicious behavior here," he said, his tone suggesting that he found the allegation preposterous. I nearly chuckled at the notion. Suspicious behavior? The only thing suspicious is that someone would call the police because I washed my car. I tried to keep my voice calm, though the absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. The officer's eyes softened just a fraction as he explained, "Sir, we're required to follow up on all reports. I understand that might sound ridiculous, but protocols are protocols." While the officer politely took notes and conducted a brief inspection of my property, I noticed Karen shifting on her porch. Her eyes, magnified by the glare of the early sun, fixed on me with a mix of contempt and triumph. I couldn't help but feel that she was reveling in the chaos she had instigated. After a few minutes, the officer returned. "Everything appears normal, Mr. Carter. We will file this as a false alarm," he informed me. I nodded in relief, though a part of me seethed at the injustice. This was not about safety, it was about control, about a person using her influence to police even the smallest actions. Once the police cruisers departed, Karen's smirk met my gaze from her immaculate porch. It was a look of smug satisfaction, as though she'd forced the authorities to validate her misguided vendetta. I pulled out my phone and started recording, documenting the moment for my own records. I knew I couldn't let this slide without making a stand. The recording captured not only her expression but also the empty driveway that clearly belonged to me. Throughout that day, as I resumed my chores and tried to shake off the lingering embarrassment of the incident, a storm of frustration built inside me. Every minute of that encounter was a reminder of how arbitrarily a simple act of personal maintenance could be transformed into a punitive spectacle by someone determined to micromanage every facet of community life. The idea that I was being targeted simply because I washed my car was infuriating, and it left me questioning what the true priorities were in this supposedly peaceful cul-de-sac. That evening, as I sat with a cup of tea on my back porch reflecting on the day's events, I resolved that this wasn't something I would accept silently. I would document everything and arm myself with knowledge, be it legal research or community testimonials. So that if Karen ever tried to police my actions again, would be ready to stand up for my rights. It was an awakening that a seemingly trivial conflict could serve as a battleground for personal freedom, and I felt the spark of determination to challenge the tyranny that threatened our quiet suburban life. That evening, after the bizarre morning's events, I found myself unable to relax. As the sky deepened into twilight, I replayed the day's absurdities in my mind, each scene blending into a surreal montage of suburban injustice. I, Evan Carter, was determined that I would not allow a petty complaint to redefine my life or my rights within my own property. I sat at my kitchen table and began jotting down everything I remembered in detail, every word the officer had said, every glance from Karen, even the sound of her frustrated voice when she had called 911. My pen raced across the paper as I recorded the incident, not merely for my own record-keeping but to ensure that if this harassment continued, I would have undeniable evidence. With that documentation underway, I resolved to better understand the architecture of this neighborhood tyranny. I delved into the local ordinances and HOA regulations that govern Pleasantview. It was astonishing how many rules were written in black and white, and how many of them could be twisted by someone as determined as Karen. I learned that the HOA had a near-absolute say in what was considered proper behavior, and that even the smallest deviation from their aesthetic ideals could result in severe admonition. It wasn't long before I began to suspect that Karen's relentless policing of trivial matters wasn't about community welfare at all. It was about power, and sometimes, about intolerance. I took a long, reflective walk around my block, the cool evening air helping to clear my mind. As I passed pristine lawns and immaculately tended gardens, I couldn't help but notice the subtle cues of a community held in thrall by one person's dogmatic standards. Neighbors exchanged glances that sometimes hinted at silent, shared grievances against Karen's tyrannical oversight. In a moment of resolve, I decided that I would not let this continue without a response, not only for myself but for everyone else who had endured her petty reign. That night, after a quiet dinner with Megan and the children, I fired up my computer and began compiling what I had recorded earlier that day. I scanned the handwritten notes, saved audio clips from my phone, and even aligned them chronologically to form a clear narrative of the episode. I was meticulous, determined that no detail would be overlooked. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, added up to a portrait of unchecked overreach. In parallel, I spent some time researching local legal resources online, focusing particularly on homeowner rights versus HOA regulations. I discovered that property owners were actually protected by a multitude of state laws when it came to personal property and that no resident had the right to call in the police for something as innocuous as washing their car. The knowledge was empowering. It confirmed my suspicions that Karen's actions were not only unfair but potentially unlawful. My plan began to take shape. I would be prepared if Karen tried to escalate her harassment further. I would continue documenting every encounter, every disapproving glare, every vague comment made from her porch, and, if necessary, present a comprehensive report to the HOA board. I even considered reaching out to a local community advocacy group to ensure that homeowners like me would not be bullied into compliance by a single overzealous individual. As midnight approached and I finally retreated to the study, I reflected on the transformation of what began as a simple car wash into a fight for personal dignity. I steeled my resolve, knowing that defending my rights was essential not only for me but for the entire neighborhood. The pervasive influence of a tyrannical HOA enforcer had to be challenged, and I was ready to stand up for fairness. I closed my laptop with a sense of determined calm. Tomorrow, I would follow up with neighbors who had expressed similar frustrations and perhaps even draft a letter to the HOA board. Tonight, however, I allowed myself a moment of bittersweet satisfaction, one small victory in the quiet war against suburban tyranny. The following morning, the tension in Pleasantview felt almost palpable. I, Evan Carter, awoke with a clear objective: to gather further proof that Karen's actions were not only baseless but also discriminatory. My mind raced back to the officer's report that mentioned suspicious activity, a report that, in my view, was nothing more than an excuse for Karen to police my simple act of washing my car. Determined to build a rock-solid case, I decided to document every interaction I might have with this overbearing presence. Before leaving home, I made sure my phone was fully charged and checked that my camera app was set to record. I'd already saved the audio of the police encounter, and now I resolved to record any further run-ins. After a quick breakfast with Megan, I left the house on my usual route for the day, keeping a careful eye on the streets and, especially, on Karen's imposing figure. Every so often, I would catch glimpses of her, her silhouette standing rigidly by her manicured lawn, eyes scanning for any hint of disorder. It was as if she was on a permanent patrol, a self-styled enforcer whose sole purpose was to ensure that the pristine standards of Pleasantview were upheld at all costs. I couldn't help but feel that her actions were more about asserting control than about community safety, and I took note of every encounter. During lunch, as I sat at a local cafe and listened to hushed conversations, I overheard neighbors recounting similar experiences. One elderly man whispered, "I once saw her write a letter to the HOA about someone's mismatched mailbox colors." Another lady remarked, she called the police because a dog barked too loudly at a parking lot. The stories, though seemingly trivial, painted a clear picture of a woman with an iron fist, using the weight of the HOA to suppress any deviation from her idea of perfection. After gathering these oral accounts, I returned home and began poring over online HOA documents. I learned that the rules in Pleasantview were remarkably strict. So strict that even a minor act like washing one's car could be construed as a disturbance if not done properly. What struck me most was a clause regarding undue obstruction of common property, a phrase vague enough to be stretched to Karen's advantage. It appeared that some in the HOA had previously supported her punitive measures simply because they were ambiguous. This only fueled my determination to challenge her authority. I then organized the information I had collected over the past few days into a digital folder. I sorted photos, audio clips, and screenshots of online forum discussions where fellow residents expressed their frustration. Every piece of evidence confirmed one thing: Karen was abusing her power. I even reached out discreetly to a few neighbors, asking them if I could record short testimonies about their experiences with her. One neighbor, Mr. Grayson, tearfully admitted, "I've been living here for 20 years, and I've never seen our community treated so unfairly. She has no right to dictate how we use our property." Their voices, though soft, resonated with the shared pain of being micromanaged by a tyrant. That afternoon, with my digital dossier growing larger, I drafted a detailed timeline of incidents that spanned several weeks, from minor grievances to the outright racial profiling incident involving the police. I cross-referenced local laws and HOA regulations to ensure that my case was watertight. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. I was not merely defending my right to wash my car, I was fighting for the dignity of every resident in Pleasantview. By early evening, I had a clear plan. I would compile this evidence and present it to the HOA board at the next meeting. I also considered contacting local advocacy groups to raise awareness of Karen's abuse of power. Though I wasn't out for revenge, I knew that exposing the truth was essential to restoring balance in our community. As darkness fell and I reviewed my notes one final time before bed, a sense of resolve washed over me. I recognized that the simple act of washing my car had inadvertently become a catalyst for a much larger battle, a battle for fairness and respect in a neighborhood marred by petty authoritarianism. I closed my laptop, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, confident that together, we could reclaim our rights. In the days following my decision to fight back, the energy in Pleasantview became charged with anticipation. I, Evan Carter, continued to document every encounter with Karen, my resolve growing stronger with each reported injustice. Meanwhile, whispers about my determination spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors began nodding their heads discreetly, as if silently affirming that someone had to take a stand against Karen's oppressive regime. Every morning, I made it a habit to take a short walk around my block, deliberately passing by Karen's well-manicured estate. I noticed that she walked faster than before, her posture more alert, as though she were expecting a challenge at any moment. Her previously effortless scowl now seemed forced, a mask hastily worn to cover mounting insecurity. I captured these moments on video whenever the opportunity arose, her glances directed at my house, her hurried steps when she thought she caught me gazing in her direction, all of it stored for future reference. At home, I devoted several afternoons to reading and researching local statutes regarding property rights and HOA regulations. I discovered that many of the rules imposed in Pleasantview, while codified on paper, were open to interpretation, an ambiguity that Karen exploited to justify her every whim. The legal nuances I uncovered made it clear, as a homeowner, I had the right to use my driveway and maintain my property as I saw fit. No one, not even a self-appointed enforcer, had the right to disrupt that. During one of these intensive research sessions, I received a call from Mrs. Langley, a longtime resident and former member of the HOA board. In hushed tones, she described how Karen's behavior had worsened over the past year, and how several board members had secretly grown weary of her domineering tactics. "People are fed up," she confided. "They fear speaking out because she wields the rules like a weapon." Her words added a communal dimension to my personal fight. I wasn't alone, many had silently suffered under Karen's rigid supervision. Inspired by Mrs. Langley's admission, I reached out to a couple more neighbors who had experienced similar indignities. I arranged discreet meetings in local coffee shops, where I gathered oral testimonies and asked if I could record their accounts. What emerged was a tapestry of shared grievances. Unsolicited fines for minor infractions, constant surveillance through neighborhood apps, and even whispers of retaliatory actions against those who dared to question Karen's authority. I compiled all this information into a comprehensive digital dossier. Each file was meticulously labeled, dates, times, locations, and the names of those affected. I felt empowered by the collective voice rising in support, though I knew the next step would be the most daunting, confronting the HOA board with this evidence. I drafted a detailed memorandum that outlined how Karen's actions were not only an abuse of power but a violation of both local law and community trust. That very evening, after dinner with Megan and the kids, I posted an update on a local forum encouraging residents to come forward with their experiences. The response was overwhelming. Messages of solidarity poured in, along with suggestions for formal petitions and even legal consultations. One resident wrote, "I've kept a diary of every incident, never thought I'd see the day when we unite against such tyranny." These affirmations bolstered my resolve. This was not an isolated struggle, but a collective battle for dignity and fairness. Over the next several days, I even prepared for the possibility of an emergency HOA meeting. I printed out copies of my memorandum and arranged them in a neat binder. My plan was to present the information publicly, making it impossible for the board to ignore the systematic abuses that had become all too common under Karen's reign. I knew that such a confrontation would be polarizing and that Karen might retaliate fiercely. Yet, the prospect of changing the status quo, of reclaiming our neighborhood from petty despotism, was a goal worth the risk. Every minute that passed added momentum to my cause. By the end of the week, I felt not only a burning desire for justice but also the quiet confidence that I had the support of a community eager for change. With every documented grievance and every shared testimony, I prepared myself for the day when the full might of collective truth would force the HOA to reevaluate who truly governed Pleasantview. As I finally locked up for the night, I couldn't help but think that I was on the brink of something monumental, a chance not just to defend my own rights, but to restore a sense of genuine community where every homeowner's freedom was respected. The long-anticipated HOA meeting arrived under a crisp autumn sky. I, Evan Carter, arrived early at the community center, my binder of evidence clutched tightly in hand. The room was already abuzz with murmurs from residents who, like me, had grown weary of Karen's unilateral enforcement of rules. Whispers of grievances, quiet nods of solidarity, and cautious glances toward the front of the room all spoke of a community ready for change. The meeting began in the customary fashion, formal introductions, a review of mundane topics like trash pickup schedules and lawn maintenance guidelines. However, the tone shifted dramatically when the board's moderator asked if there were any new matters to discuss. Seizing the opportunity, I stood and projected calm determination. "I have something important to address that affects all of us," I announced. With a deep breath, I launched into a detailed account of the days following the infamous trash day. I recounted how, while I was simply washing my car, a peaceful, unremarkable activity on my property, I was unjustly targeted by Karen. I described the police's brief involvement, the absurd allegation of suspicious activity simply for performing a routine chore, and, most damning of all, the clear evidence of bias when Karen explicitly mentioned my race. As I spoke, I displayed the photos and written records stored in my digital dossier, carefully outlining every event with precise timestamps and corroborated witness statements. The evidence included the audio recording of the officers' interaction, screenshots of text messages from sympathetic neighbors, and even short video clips I'd compiled from various moments of Karen's confrontational behavior. With every slide that appeared on the projector, a murmur of astonishment swept through the room. Several residents leaned forward in their seats, their faces lit by the glow of the screen as they absorbed the undeniable proof of how their neighbors' overreach had disrupted our peaceful suburban life. Karen, who had been sitting near the front in a sharply tailored outfit that no longer seemed immaculate but rather strained under the weight of her own defiance, reacted immediately. Her face, once set in an expression of imperious indifference, contorted into one of shock and indignation as the evidence mounted. "This is a misunderstanding," she began, voice wavering as she tried to interject. "I was simply ensuring that proper order was maintained." But her words were drowned out by a chorus of discontent from the assembled homeowners. A well-respected resident, Mrs. Ellison, rose to speak. "I, too, have endured countless fines and intrusive visits from Karen," she said softly but firmly. "It's time we demand accountability from someone who abuses their power under the guise of community protection." Her words resonated with many, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of cautious curiosity to fervent collective resolve. I continued, detailing the legal research I had conducted. I explained that, under local property laws, no one had the authority to report a homeowner simply for using their own driveway or securing their belongings. I cited specific clauses from our local municipality's guidelines, which unequivocally stated that homeowners enjoyed the right to privacy and freedom on their own property. The clarity of the law provided a stark counterpoint to Karen's narrative, and several board members nodded in agreement as I spoke. By the time I concluded my presentation, the room was filled with a heavy silence, one that signaled the magnitude of what had just transpired. The board president, Mrs. Clark, looked around the room, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Carter, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. We will convene an emergency session to review the policies and address the abuses of power you've so clearly documented." Karen's attempt to defend herself turned to bitter protest, but her words faltered as the collective weight of the evidence made her position untenable. Some of her previously loyal supporters began to murmur their doubts, their faith in her authority waning with every documented misdeed. As the meeting adjourned, numerous residents approached me, expressing their gratitude and renewed hope for a fairer community. "You've opened our eyes, Evan," one said, while another added, "Now, we can finally reclaim our neighborhood from tyranny." Walking out of the community hall that day, I felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph, a sense that even in a place as outwardly serene as Pleasantview, the truth can spark a revolution. In the weeks that followed the explosive HOA meeting, the atmosphere in Pleasantview underwent a dramatic transformation. The emergency review launched by the board yielded swift results. The new leadership denounced the unchecked authority of Karen and vowed to reform the outdated regulations that had allowed her to rule with an iron fist. I, Evan Carter, observed that something remarkable had happened. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak up now did so openly. The oppressive hush that had blanketed our cul-de-sac was gradually replaced by an air of cautious optimism and renewed community spirit. It seemed as if, for the first time in years, residents realized that our shared neighborhood was ours to govern together, not dictated by one self-appointed enforcer. The board's decision was decisive. Karen would no longer hold sway over Pleasantview's daily affairs. New policies were enacted to ensure transparency, and an independent committee was formed to oversee HOA enforcement, protecting homeowners from arbitrary fines and unwarranted complaints. For many, it felt like the shackles had been lifted, and a tangible sense of fairness returned to our streets. Personally, I experienced a deep satisfaction. My red car, now washed and gleaming under a gentle autumn sun, became a silent emblem of my right to live and maintain my property in peace. I even added a small plaque next to my driveway that read, "Freedom is our right." It was a modest gesture, yet a powerful reminder of the change that had been set in motion. Throughout the neighborhood, subtle shifts emerged. Lawns that had once been pruned strictly by order were now allowed a bit of natural charm. Conversations by mailboxes took on a more relaxed tone, and I began noticing a renewed sense of trust among neighbors. Even Karen herself was rarely seen in public. When she did appear, she was noticeably subdued, her once haughty demeanor replaced by tentative politeness. Local media picked up the story as well, dubbing it, "The Day a Car Wash Sparked a Suburban Revolution." Headlines celebrated the courage of a single homeowner who took a stand against petty tyranny and racial profiling. In editorial columns, many praised Pleasantview residents for reclaiming their community and challenging authority when it overstepped its bounds. At home, Megan and I often reflected on how an ordinary Saturday had spiraled into something much larger, a powerful lesson in standing up for one's rights. We resolved to stay involved, attending future HOA meetings and ensuring that the spirit of fairness would not be compromised again. As dusk fell one crisp evening, I sat on my porch watching neighbors return from their daily routines, now buoyed by a renewed sense of empowerment. In that moment, I realized that even the smallest acts, a car wash, a locked shed, or a well-timed protest, can spark a fire that transforms an entire community. In the immediate aftermath of the HOA upheaval, the effects of our collective action began to manifest throughout Pleasantview. The relentless scrutiny and arbitrary power wielded by Karen had finally been exposed, and the community was abuzz with talk of accountability. As the weeks passed, I, Evan Carter, observed how the once dreaded specter of a tyrannical enforcer was slowly fading from our neighborhood's consciousness. The local media continued to feature the story, and online discussions thrived. Social media platforms were filled with clips from that fateful day, the recorded exchange with police, Karen's exaggerated 911 call, and the moment when she was finally forced to face her own misconduct. Memes exploded like wildfire, images of pink SUVs, sarcastic captions about parking privileges, and humorous remixes of Karen's dramatic tirades. While these social media moments brought levity to some, they also underscored the seriousness of her abuse of power. At the same time, the new HOA board, now firmly in control, implemented sweeping reforms. They revised rules that had long allowed for overly broad interpretations of what constituted a violation. A community task force was set up to mediate disputes in a fair and transparent manner. For many residents, some of whom had silently borne the brunt of Karen's irrational policing, the change was a breath of fresh air. Conversations in the cul-de-sac took on an atmosphere of cautious optimism and mutual respect. Personally, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My efforts to document the unfolding events had not been in vain. Neighbors who had once feared retribution now spoke freely about their own experiences, sharing stories of arbitrary fines and intrusive calls. I received heartfelt thanks on the street, with several residents complimenting me for standing up for Pleasantview. Even a few local business owners, those who had lost sales due to the previous climate of fear, expressed gratitude, noting that a more open community was good for everyone. Yet, amid this progress, I couldn't completely shake a lingering ambivalence. Though justice had been partly served, I often reflected on the personal toll the ordeal had taken. The confrontation had exposed a deep-rooted culture of entitlement and prejudice. I wondered if some wounds might take longer to heal than others. One quiet evening, as I sat on my porch overlooking a street that now felt friendlier, I thought about the lessons learned from the tumult. In Pleasantview, we discovered that small, everyday acts, like washing one's car, could become battlegrounds for civil rights when power was abused. It taught us that vigilance and unity were the keys to protecting our freedoms. Even now, every time I lock my car after a wash, I do so with a sense of pride, a silent protest against any future attempt to curtail my rights. The memory of Karen's dramatic downfall, though bittersweet, served as a powerful reminder that our voices, when united, could drive meaningful change. As the community gradually moved forward, we carried with us the knowledge that justice is not merely an abstract concept but a goal that can be achieved when people refuse to remain silent in the face of tyranny. In the final phase of this extraordinary saga, the ripple effects of our actions had settled into a new equilibrium for Pleasantview. The fallout from the incident had not only reshaped the power dynamics within the HOA but also reinvigorated community spirit on a broader scale. I, Evan Carter, found that my once unremarkable life had taken on a new significance, a reminder that even the most mundane events can spark monumental change. Following the turbulent events and Karen's public disgrace, the new HOA board immediately set about revising policies. Outdated rules that had enabled the unchecked enforcement of arbitrary standards were scrapped in favor of measures that emphasized transparency, fairness, and resident participation. Meetings became more inclusive, with every homeowner given a voice in decisions affecting our shared neighborhood. This sweeping reform generated a palpable sense of relief among residents, who finally felt empowered to shape their own community. On a personal level, I embraced my role as an unexpected catalyst for change. I attended community meetings regularly, not to seek praise, but to ensure that the lessons from our past were not forgotten. Neighbors began approaching me with their own stories of grievance, tales of unwarranted fines, intrusion into private lives, and general harassment by those in power. I listened, documented, and even organized informal gatherings to share our collective experiences. The solidarity was heartening. It transformed our formerly muted frustrations into a robust call for accountability. Local media picked up the story too. Headlines extolled that day a car wash sparked a community revolution, turning our humble neighborhood into a symbol of grassroots resistance against despotic rule. Although I never intended to become a local hero, I found that the shared narrative of standing up for one's rights resonated deeply throughout Pleasantview. At home, every object bore new meaning. My red car, once merely a machine to be cleaned, had become an icon of defiance. My driveway and even that familiar, well-worn padlock on my shed represented the right to maintain one's private space without undue interference. I even put up a small plaque that read, "Our property, our rights," which I saw as a quiet salute to the power of standing up for oneself. Yet, as with any revolutionary change, there were moments of introspection. I often wondered if the loss and humiliation that Karen suffered, losing her job, facing legal charges, and ultimately being forced to leave the neighborhood, had been an unavoidable consequence of her own actions, or if the cost of our collective stand had been higher than necessary. The thought weighed on me, but the overwhelming support from my neighbors reassured me that our pursuit of justice had been both fair and necessary. In the end, as I sat on my porch one mild evening watching the sun descend over a revitalized Pleasantview, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Our community had reclaimed its voice, we had turned a petty altercation into a lesson in accountability and unity. Though the road ahead might bring further challenges, I was confident that together, we could preserve the spirit of fairness and mutual respect for generations to come. I, Evan Carter, now sign off with gratitude for the strength and resilience of our community, and a reminder to always stand up for what's right, even if it starts with something as simple as washing your car.